So this section, the title probably seems a little bit ambiguous, and there's no mistake in that. This is going to be the haziest of these sections, because while I do want to give you some insight and drill a little bit deeper on what individual cognitive abilities look like and the different ways we can arrange them together to think of intelligence as a whole, this is probably, because I'm jumping around quite a lot here, potentially the most confusing section out of everything I've been talking about in this lecture, just because, again, if I were doing this for an undergraduate psychology class, I would go into a lot of detail and scaffold every one of these things I'm talking about, but you only need to know a little of this as allied health practitioners. You just need to know the general shape of them and how they fit in together. So to try to reduce how confusing the jumping around I'll be doing during this section could potentially be, there are three key insights. I just want to front load them at the beginning of this little video so that you know what to look for as we're going through this. There's just three main things I want you to take away from this. One is that our cognitive abilities, our specific cognitive abilities, are developmental in nature. And the way that we develop them is that they don't all come as one big package to begin with, but rather we start out with a very small number of instinctual cognitive abilities. Through experience of the world, we build up and develop new ones, bit by bit along the way, and the competencies that we build up in the past form the basis of the new abilities we'll have in the future. We kind of stack them on top of each other, get more cognitively complex. That's why cognitive abilities follow such a clear trajectory under most circumstances, that Binet could have looked at them in that way, where you have a mental age versus a chronological age. The next element to keep in mind, and this is one of the biggest insights of applied cognitive science and the cognitive perspective on psychology, which dominates everything we're talking about this week, is that all of our complex abilities are simple neurological circuits. Complex abilities are made of multiple smaller circuits built up together. Everything kind of runs on a simple autopilot in your head when you get down to it that way. So when you think of a complicated cognitive ability versus a simple cognitive ability, the complex ones are always made of smaller, less complex ones. It's sort of circuits all the way down when you're looking at the functionality of the brain. So it's important to understand how they layer on top of each other, and new abilities emerge from the combination of a greater number of simpler abilities. And the last thing that I'm going to emphasize here, again, I could go at great length on this by itself, but is the notion that, again, the takeaway message you need to have for this is that, for the most part, your brain runs on autopilot. We talked before in memory about how your working memory is the conscious subset of whatever it is your brain is working on at the moment. Most of what your brain is doing otherwise are these simple automatic cognitive tasks that run on autopilot and just feed inputs in, when it's relevant, to your working memory, to your real-time consciousness. And therefore, most of the thoughts that we have just kind of emerge into consciousness. We don't realize how we derived them, and they take all kinds of shortcuts behind the scenes that, again, it's good to be aware of, just because sometimes they will lead you astray. So, talking about cognitive abilities, again, we're doing this from the cognitive perspective, as the name would suggest. We're taking an information processing approach on this, and the way that more complex systems are built out of less complex systems. Most of this notion, the idea of how our perceptions, our ideas, and the ways we transform information in our minds in order to do the useful functional things that we do, a lot of it goes back to the work of developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. He looked like this. It's very hard to find a picture of Piaget where he doesn't have a pipe in his mouth. That was very much what he did with his time. But Piaget, he did a lot of physiology work earlier in his life, and then focused on his own children to start looking at the developmental trajectories of how children gain their cognitive competencies over time. Piaget, more so than anyone else, especially in the Western traditions of this, discovered that humans go through what we would refer to as developmental stages. That, we have an adult phenotype of all the things that an adult is mentally capable of, a much smaller repertoire of what a child is capable of, and then we build up through stages, going from, child to adult. Not just, it's not just continuous development where you're always improving the same bits and pieces, but you have these qualitative stages where new abilities burst forth onto the scene, built out of the simple accomplishments and competencies of the earlier layers. To give a really quick example, there's many different ways we could go into this. Piaget discovered a ton of stuff on this, but just to give a really quick example, there's a phenomenon in cognition we refer to as conservation. The intuitive sense that appearance does not dictate the total reality of something that you see, that the amounts of things or the characteristics of things are conserved. They're an intrinsic property of them, even if their appearance changes. We develop this ability in what is referred to as the concrete operational phase of cognitive development. Piaget pointed out that a lot of children under the age of 6, if you take 2 beakers, equal size of colored liquid, and say, is there the same amount of liquid in both of them? They'll say, yeah, it looks like it. And then you take one of them and in front of the child, pour it into a taller container, and then say, how about now? Is there more in one or the other? They will very often say, there's more in the tall one. Tallness indicates that there is more, so you have produced more of this somehow, maybe through magic, in front of my eyes. They don't get that because they're watching the same quantity move about, that the volume must be conserved. A lot of children younger than 6 will be fooled by this. There's some mental milestones they need to master along the way to get over it, but very few children over the age of 7. It's a stage-like sort of switch they go through. Very few children over the age of 7 are fooled by this kind of problem. So if I were to break it down really quickly, Piaget had 4 major developmental stages that we cognitively go through, and he pointed out what the cognitive accomplishments, the new mental ability you develop in each of these stages are. So there's the sensory motor stage from the birth to the age of around 2. The main thing that children master in this period of time is learning, well, there's some social elements like stranger anxiety and things like this, but the main one is object permanence, learning that objects have robust properties and that they continue to exist when they are hidden. This is why the game Peekaboo is very fascinating to small children, but as they approach the age of 2, they very quickly suddenly don't find it interesting anymore, because you're not vanishing anymore. They're just like, oh, you're behind your hands, you still exist when I don't see you. It's a mental accomplishment that they make. The pre-operational stage, children start to develop language and simple symbolic reasoning and things like this, but they suffer from egocentrism. They struggle to see the world from other people's perspectives, or to imagine that other people know things that they do not know, and vice versa. Then they hit the concrete operational phase. They gain most of the abilities that an adult has to reason about things. They lose egocentrism. They can do conservation. They can do basic mathematical operations and things like this. They can imagine things, processes going backwards and forwards. But it's not until they hit the last one, past the age of 12, the formal operational phase, that you enter that phase you're in as an adult, where not only do you reason about things in concrete ways, but you can reason from principles, and you can reason in abstract ways. You can use, abstract algebra, you can do hypothetico-deductive reasoning, all these kinds of complicated things you need to do as an adult that are completely beyond the purview of children. So, Piaget, really underestimated for the most part when he was doing his initial models how early some of these milestones are capable of developing. He took very much for granted how much, being in his particular cultural environment, Switzerland at the time, provided additional cultural instruction and scaffolding for the abilities children would develop. In fact, this is probably something that is going to be talked about in the practical lecture, but a developmental theorist whose name was Vygotsky described this as being the zone of proximal development, that at any given stage, children have the next thing that they could develop or move on to, or adults who are learning new skills have the next stage they're capable of moving on to. And so, things that are too easy are boring, things that are too difficult bring on anxiety and challenge, but there is a nice middle zone in there, and it's important on practical terms if you can find it, where you can get adults to learn things faster if you provide them the right kind of instruction. You can get children to hit developmental milestones slightly sooner if you can provide the right kind of instruction at the right time. Now, when we talk about levels of cognitive abilities, again, I'm trying to put this together from the perspective that it's the smaller abilities that make up the more complex abilities. One of the best ways to visualize this is John Carroll's 3-stratum model, although even it is a bit of a simplification. For example, stratum 1 here only has a handful of items on it, but if we were to do it realistically, there's no way I would fit it on a slide. It would just be this gigantic list of individual abilities and responses you can give. But the idea is that these very simple, reflex-like tasks that you do on level of stratum 1, spatial scanning, word fluency, sound localization, things like this, you can aggregate those together into more abstract functional units, your processing speed, your general auditory perception, things like this. And then when you generalize the statistical characteristic of all of these together, the thing that they all share, the top of it is G, is that general intelligence I was talking about before. That's how these multiple levels of constructs relate to each other. You know, on the material level, they're very, very small individual neurological circuits, but on a functional level, we can abstract it as much as we need to describe whatever is the useful level for this. Out of those levels, especially the Stratum 2 ones, obviously you don't need to know the vast majority of them, but there is one example that would be especially useful in applied terms as you work as an allied health professional, especially with young versus geriatric populations, and that is the concept of fluid versus crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the mental processes we employ when negotiating novel or unexpected things. It's how your mind adapts to new circumstances, whereas your crystallized intelligence is the knowledge and skills you have built up through past experience, you know, the competencies you have gained from things you have done or mastered in the past. The important thing about these two things, aside from being conceptually a bit different from each other, you know, once you master something with your fluid intelligence, it becomes crystallized intelligence, is that your fluid intelligence declines with age, whereas your crystallized intelligence, because you're building it up through life experience, tends to incrementally increase as you get older and then eventually level off. This means that if you're dealing with, you know, aging populations, for example, fluid intelligence starts to drop off immediately after young adulthood. As people approach into middle age and old age, a lot of you may have noticed this with your parents and their ability to use smartphones or something like this. Your ability to engage with new things, your ability to learn something new from scratch, it gets more and more difficult as you go along. You kind of hit an asymptote there, and it flips, and then it starts to get harder and harder. But crystallized intelligence, hard-won expertise built on life experience, only keeps rising. People only get more experienced and more competent in these domains the more opportunities to engage with them they have. So, I mean, some people like to make sweeping generalizations. You know, oh, older people have less intelligence than younger people do. That's absolutely not true. They generally have much better crystallized intelligence, much better skillful or knowledge-based understanding of whatever it is their field of expertise, but what they've lost is their fluid intelligence. They've lost the dynamic ability for their brain to learn something new from scratch. Last thing I want to talk about here is that idea that I mentioned before, the shortcuts that the unconscious mind, the circuitry of your brain that you're not consciously aware of, takes in order to optimize your experience of the world. The language that we use for this, for these rule of thumb, shortcut decision rules that the circuits of our brain make when we're not consciously aware of them, in the biz we refer to them as heuristics. So that's an important word to get under your belt. The main way that we split this, and you'll see some of this language in the textbook if you look at it, is as the difference between explicit and implicit cognition. Explicit cognition is the conscious stuff that we do on purpose, largely relies on our working memory. Implicit cognition draws on our procedural memory and tends to be the things that we can do but we're not aware that we're capable of doing. It's the autopilot stuff that your brain is doing behind the scenes. So to give you just some quick examples of some heuristics that have been identified by behavioral economists and psychologists in the past, take for example the availability heuristic. When you have to make a judgment of how likely a hypothetical situation will be, you often don't actually compute a complicated, a complicated series of statistical steps about this. You usually make just a substitution judgment. You think, well, how easily does an example of that from my memory come to mind? I will use how easy that availability of my memories is as a substitute for the likelihood of this event. Just to give a quick example here, an example of the availability heuristic, parents often insist on driving their children to school for fear, based on things they've seen in the news that easily come to memory of child predators or something like this, despite the fact that dying of car accidents is 75% as likely as losing your child to a child predator. But again, we don't think of it this way because one of these is so background in our lives they don't come to memory very easily. The other ones are sensational items we see in the news. The representativeness heuristic. That's when we judge situations as being more likely the more they conform to our expectations or stereotypes. Just to give a quick example of that, people usually estimate, if you show them a picture of a large man with hairy arms and a baseball cap or something like this, they're more likely to assume that such a man is likely to be a trucker than a retail worker, despite the fact that in every Western country there's at least twice as many retail workers as there are truckers, again, the underlying probability is being obscured by how much that meets the stereotype of a trucker, a big guy with hairy arms, etc. And last one I'll look at here is the affect heuristic. We often assume that the relative safety or danger of a situation directly corresponds with the type of emotion it evokes in us, how much fear, how much anxiety, etc. comes out of it. It's a very funny example here. Take in Australia, especially in Western Australia, people fund shark culls out of fear of shark attacks, imagining that vivid, frightening sensation of a shark attacking you at the beach. And despite that, you're more likely to die in an accident where you accidentally set your pajamas on fire than you are to be attacked by a shark. Again, the actual real danger posed by these things isn't captured by our emotion sensation, the emotions that are evoked by this, so we make an incorrect judgment because we're relying on this heuristic, this shortcut rule that exists behind the scenes. If anyone wants to know more information about how heuristics work, there's an excellent book written by Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, about all the differences between explicit and implicit cognition. But I'll put that off, and its video's already a bit over time on this, so I'll see you in the very last video, genetics versus environment, as it pertains to intelligence. I'll see you there.